Jordan Peterson loves to cite stories from the Bible, but he consistently misses the most important points to those stories, and they make a big difference to how we understand what God is up to. Let's check it out.
I'm going to walk through a couple of narrative representations of that, and it'll tie it back to the imagery of Revelation. You might find this interesting. So you see that dynamic play out in the opening chapters of Genesis, because what you have is the descendants of Cain. So Cain makes improper sacrifices, and he becomes bitter and resentful, and he turns to technology. It's Cain's descendants that turn to technology first. They build the first cities, and then the city becomes corrupt. It becomes corrupt in the direction of the Tower of Babel.
The people who built the city were corrupt, and so their corruption was magnified. Okay, so again, I keep returning to this idea of Socrates from the Republic, but this is an important point because we just did several videos dealing with giants and Babel and the connection. We actually, there's a live stream, and I will link that for you guys if you're interested in looking at this deeper. But I just love that Jordan Peterson is so stuck on the Cain and Abel story, and yet sort of painfully misses. He's fixated on Cain because the story does sort of follow Cain, but God is looking at Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's sacrifice. And so Abel's sacrifice is a blood sacrifice of the innocent on behalf of the guilty. The reason God looks at Abel's sacrifice is that is a clue to where we need to go if we're wanting solutions to the problem of the sickness of the soul, which has been magnified into the arena of the city. Now, of course, the story follows Cain because Abel is dead. He's in the ground. He no longer speaks. Or does he? Hebrews 11 has some interesting things to tell us about this passage. And this is, again, part of the reason why I think this story is so important and why it's important to kind of I love that Jordan Peterson likes this story, but it's hard for me to hear him tell it and miss the whole other side of it. Hebrews 11:4 says, "By faith Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained the testimony that he was righteous, God testifying about his gifts. And through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks." That is why we need to pay attention to Abel's sacrifice over Cain's. Cain's sacrifice is important. Cain's story is important. I don't want to take away from that. But we have to, God is the one looking at Abel's sacrifice. So we need to draw our attention to Abel's sacrifice and wonder what it was that Abel was gesturing to that Cain was not. Cain was gesturing to the earth. It was an earthly sacrifice. Abel's sacrifice, on the other hand, was the sacrifice of the innocent life on behalf of the guilty, because Abel understood what God was up to. He understood the plan of God, the plan that was revealed in Genesis 3:15. How much of it he understood, I don't know, but his sacrifice obviously indicates that he knew an innocent person, an innocent life would have to be sacrificed on behalf of the guilty. Did he know that God was going to do that, that he was going to come in the person of Jesus and die so that we could be rescued through his resurrection, that the resurrection of Jesus Christ would be that hope for humanity that would cure the ills of the city and the soul that we've been talking about. I don't know, but it seems like he knew something that Cain did not understand. So it's really important that we look at Abel's sacrifice along with Cain's.
Now, the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat, right? It's a stepped pyramid. And at that time, the potentates of the Middle East were competing to build the largest ziggurats. They were trying to build towers to heaven to glorify themselves. And that's the subtext of the Tower of Babel story. So what happens is that the ultimate Tower of Babel is erected to reach to the sky, and that's a challenge to the supremacy of God. And the consequence of that is that the cosmos, the spirit of the cosmos, the creative producer of the cosmos, makes all those who inhabit the tower unable to communicate with one another. So they start to lose even the ability to share concepts, and the structure collapses. And it's because that Tower of Babel is too large, it reaches too high, it's too uniform, and it's destined to failure. Of course, that begs the question, what's the alternative to that? But I would say the entire remaining biblical corpus is actually an attempt to answer that question, but it's very germane. Now, that imagery is picked up again in the book of Revelation. So one of the central images in the book that I think is very relevant, imagine that the book of Revelation is trying to conceptualize the apocalypse as such, the manner in which things deteriorate before the ultimate disaster. And so one of the main images is of a seven-headed beast. And on the back of the beast is the whore of Babylon. And it's an image of a centralizing state, a monstrous centralizing state, that's a good way of thinking about it, with multiple heads, with something like disinhibited licentiousness as its partner. That's the image. And so the notion there is that when things deteriorate to the point where apocalypse is likely, you have the construction of monstrous state-like apparatuses aligned with individual fragmentation down to the point of licentious atomization. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Okay, so if you are following that, it's so fascinating because this interview came out after we did the live stream on connecting Genesis to the book of Revelation. My hypothesis is that, yes, the Tower of Babel is about human pride, but it's also about something much more, that when humanity is united in defiance of Yahweh, they have an ability to either manifest, create, or at least feed the spirit of the age, the spirit of man. The kingdom of man grows out of control, so much so that humanity is going to destroy itself. So God actually intervenes to save humanity. That's the story of Noah. That's the story of the Tower of Babel. He breaks up the power of that egregore, the spirit of man or the kingdom of man, into these different tribal, pagan nations now. So you have all these little smaller tribes. So again, maybe check out that live stream. We go into more detail on that. But now we're thinking about it in the geopolitical arena of our modern day and say, okay, what sort of beast are we facing? Because that to me is kind of the link between Babel and Genesis, is that the beast that is called forth is sort of a manifestation of that human sin. It's the manifestation of human arrogance, this defiance of God. And then, of course, the beast comes to enslave humanity. So there's a certain power that beast has. And again, I'm sort of working this out. So I would love to hear some feedback on this. But the beast is sort of represented by these world forces, if we look at Ephesians 6, that we tend to look at in the political arena, but they are more than that. Again, I don't want to make the same mistake as the modern naturalistic person and just look at it as like, oh, that's just happening in the political arena. No, the reason it's happening in the political arena is that there's something else happening in the spiritual arena, and those are not distinct and separate. They're part of one world.